Good morning, everyone, and welcome back once again. This course in End-of-Life Bioethics in the program of the Masters of Bioethics at St. Thomas University. Always beginning with a little prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Blessed Trinity, we love you, we adore you, and we thank you for your many blessings. We ask that you send your Holy Spirit to illumine our hearts and minds, always to discern your will in our lives, and especially we ask your blessings upon our teaching, our program, as we seek to deal with these end-of-life issues that are delicate and complicated, involving the lives of real people and their loved ones. And yet you give us guidance, Lord, you give us guidance through your teaching so that we may make the proper decisions in life and help others also to make these decisions, especially when someone is approaching the end of their life here on earth. In a special way, during this time, we ask for those who are most in need of your divine mercy at this time. And we ask this in the name of Christ, our Lord. Amen. Okay, so we have just 2 more lectures to go, right? This one and next Saturday. And today we're going to be talking about nutrition and hydration toward the end of life. And then next week, it's kind of a rounding up, especially to review certain principles that we use in end-of-life issues and principles that apply to bioethics in general. Okay. So as always, I ask, first of all, if there are any questions or comments from previous lectures or anything in the program, anything that anyone wants to bring up, feel free to do so. Otherwise, okay, so we'll start with nutrition and hydration, which is probably one of the most delicate topics in end-of-life issues. And you'll see how it is the critical distinction between killing or allowing to die. All right. So first, distinction between cure and care, because I was pointing out even last lecture, the whole issue of benevolence and beneficence, right? We are capable of willing the good, and therefore we should practice the good, we should do the good, which is in healthcare, the practice of medicine, even though it does go diametrically opposed to natural selection. The rest of nature is guided essentially by natural selection, but because we have this capacity to care for others and to heal them through the practice of medicine, then it is good to be involved in that, even picking up on the first principle of medicine, which is to do no harm, right? Now, we also realize that sooner or later, regardless of what condition we have, there will be no more cure. At some point, there will be no more cure, so we will all become, as they say, terminal at one point, right? And so medicine is not limitless. Medicine continues to advance through the centuries, but there are limits. And sooner or later, we will become terminal, either abruptly or in a long, prolonged way. But we know that it's coming sooner or later. At that time, care always obligates. And that's why we make a distinction between cure and care. Even if there's no more cure, care is considered standard, ordinary means of life support. And because it's ordinary, then it obligates bioethically, all right? And we can ask the basic question, then what is care? What is care? We can reduce it to the minimum that is necessary for staying alive as humans. So basically, nutrition, hydration, shelter, meaning not be exposed to the elements, right? And then human interaction also. So human interaction is more at the psychological level, but again, following on the vision, the holistic vision of the human person, body and soul one, as St. John Paul II reminds us many times that we are body and soul one. And therefore, we have to take into account also the psychological and the spiritual dimension as integral to our humanity. And you can see that nutrition, hydration, and shelter refer more to the physical, physiological state or well-being. But then there is the psychological and the spiritual well-being. We should never be deprived of human interaction somehow, even if the persons who are taking care of us need to be in full gown from head to toe because they might infect us or we might infect them. Still, we should never be deprived of human interaction. Okay, it's part of normal care. All right, going forward then, keeping this as the bare minimum for caring for a dying patient, then we have to see with regards to nutrition and hydration. That's what I'm going to focus on today, precisely these two, food and water, right? Fluids. Typically, what is done on the patient is to see if the patient can still eat and swallow or not, all right? Because swallow is also, it's a complex behavior really. There's something that is somewhat automatic in it, but also it's a learned behavior. And particularly for the elderly, sometimes they forget how to swallow. And they will just be chewing the food and keeping the food in their mouth and they don't know what to do with it because they're either advanced dementia or Alzheimer's, and they forget, okay? So it's challenging, and we know that to get nutrition and hydration into our bodies, naturally, we have to go through the throat, right? We have to swallow. So what would be indicated then is what is known as a swallow test, to see if the person can actually swallow or if they're going to aspirate. Aspirate meaning that the food will go down into the lungs instead of the esophagus to the stomach. And that's a negative situation, clinically speaking, because then the person will get what is known as aspiration pneumonia, an infection. It's understood that what we eat, what we drink is not sterile, right? It has bacteria in it and other microorganisms, spores, fungi, etc. So if that gets into the lung, that's a very negative situation. So the swallow test typically will start with normal fluids, and then if the person starts coughing or choking, of course it's a small amount, then they'll thicken the fluids, they'll thicken the water. I don't know if you've ever seen thickened water, right? But basically they use like cornstarch or something like that. Anybody? Welcome. There's a hand out there, all right? And so in principle, it's easier to swallow something that is a little thicker so that it doesn't run too fast into the lungs. There's an experiment that people can do, but I don't recommend it. For example, if you remember in the playgrounds, sometimes there is like a ladder that is a horizontal ladder and you climb up one side and then you go across with the hands or something. You can hang upside down on the ladder. I remember hanging upside down on those things, on those iron bars. And one can swallow some food upside down. One can swallow food upside down and push it up the esophagus, okay, against gravity. But you cannot swallow water upside down because it reflects back. All right, it's too thin and it's not enough to push it, the peristaltic movement up the esophagus. So that's why fluids in particular are a challenge for someone who is having difficulty swallowing, all right? Bottom line is that if the person cannot swallow, then the food and or water, the fluids, have to be administered medically, clinically, all right? Now, I want to emphasize here that that would be artificial because it's not the natural swallowing process. But the fact that the food or water is being administered artificially doesn't mean by itself that it's extraordinary means of life support, okay? It doesn't mean that it's extraordinary. It is being assisted, but not necessarily substituting. Remember that other principle that I talked about, the critical distinction between assisting and substituting. When food or water is administered medically, it's considered assisting because basically it's bypassing the throat. But the throat by itself is not a vital organ, all right? Further down the track, the stomach, the intestines, we can claim that as vital organs. But the throat itself, because it's not a vital organ, then bypassing the throat is assisting and not substituting a vital organ, all right? It's assisting the person to stay fed and hydrated. So there are two types of medically assisted nutrition and hydration, basically. They're known as enteral nutrition or parenteral nutrition. So it depends if we're going directly into the digestive tract or if the digestive tract is not available for a number of reasons that I'll talk about in a minute, then a patient can be fed directly in through the bloodstream, all right, bypassing the digestive tract. So these are the two main options that are available clinically, enteral or parenteral. So a little bit on the terminology. Enteric is a reference to the digestive tract, to the stomach. Enteric, all right, so you'll hear about enteric medication, for example, medication that is coated so that it bypasses the stomach and then it's absorbed in the intestines. So enteral is a reference to the digestive tract. And there are a lot of acronyms, as you know, in medicine and in science in general. So EN represents enteral nutrition, and GI tract, you also run across GI tract, which is gastrointestinal tract, okay, gastrointestinal. In other words, the stomach and the intestines, the GI tract. So that's one option. If for some reason the GI tract is not available for digestion or assimilation, for example, cancer of the stomach, cancer of the intestines, all right, cancer of the colon, then another alternative is to go into the circulatory system, into the venous circulation. And that is known parenteral because here the prefix par, P-A-R, is peripheral, all right? So it's not going directly to the GI tract, but on the periphery of the GI tract, which is the circulatory system. And so that the acronym for that is PN, parenteral nutrition. And then you hear the terminology, a line or a port, a PICC line. A port is essentially a port of entry. It's a needle that is inserted into the veins so that there's direct access to the person's circulatory system. And it is the veins and not the arteries, right? Why is it the venal system and not, wait, let me backtrack for a moment. So I was getting into parental. Let me hold on parenteral, finish enteral first, and then we'll move to the second option, all right? So enteral nutrition is also known as tube feeding. So some tube have to go either into the stomach or into the intestines because we're bypassing the throat, right? And there are several options. One option is to go through the nose down into the stomach. That's called an NG tube, nasogastric tube. Nasogastric, naso is a reference to the nose, gastric a reference to the stomach. So the NG tube, when you see NG tube, that is typically a tube that goes through the nose down into the stomach directly. For the sake of completion, let me mention the other two, and then we'll talk about the time length that these tubes can be maintained in the body. If the stomach needs to be bypassed, maybe there's an ulcer, and the stomach needs some time for healing, then that tube can continue further down into the small intestine, the opening of the small intestine, which is the jejunal segment of the small intestine, the beginning. And so it's known as nasojejunal or NJ tube, NJ tube. So you got an NG tube going from the nose to the stomach, or NJ tube going from the nose through the stomach into the intestines directly, all right? You notice that different type of food is put down through each tube. But again, for the sake of completion, the third option is, so these two tubes can only stay temporarily for, I don't know, nurse, you can help me here, maybe a week or two. I don't know how long the NG or NJ tube?
Yeah, no more than a month.
A month maximum, right? Right, okay. What happens is there is irritation of the throat, and there is a possibility of infection, inflammation, and so they cannot be, they're temporary, they cannot be sustained indefinitely. And therefore, after, if the patient is still, let's say, unconscious, which is the most drastic case, the patient is perhaps in vegetative state, right, PVS, a decision needs to be made because these either NG or NJ tube need to be pulled out. And now the third option is to go directly into the stomach or into the intestines through the abdominal wall, And as drastic as that may sound, you know, going through the abdomen right directly into the stomach, clinically, medically, it's not a big deal. It's a minor surgery. It's just local anesthesia. We'll look at it in a little more detail. But medically, it's not a big deal, and it can be managed and kept clean. And then the person can stay with a PEG tube essentially indefinitely. We're talking about years, decades. All right. I've actually seen patients, a little girl who fell in a pool, became unconscious. She was little, and she's been growing in bed for decades, but she's in vegetative state. All right. And it's very challenging to disconnect or not disconnect, and when to disconnect. All right, so the percutaneous endoscopic gastrostomy, it's a big mouthful, but basically it describes percutaneous, meaning that it's going through the cutaneous, through the skin, through the abdomen, the abdominal wall. Again, we encounter the peripheral, all right? So it's going through the abdomen, into the stomach. Gastrostomy is a hole into the stomach. Endoscopic, because it is guided by an endoscope. In other words, there is a camera that is put down into the stomach to visualize the inside of the stomach and to make the connection between the outside and the inside of the tube. And that's why it's called percutaneous endoscopic gastrostomy, PEG for short, the PEG. All right, the PEG, which is essentially a tube directly into the stomach. All right, so let's look at a little bit diagram here, some ports of access. Here, this tube through the nose down into the stomach is the NG. If the stomach needs to be bypassed, it's the NJ, goes into the intestines, the jejunal. Or the other alternative here is the PEG going into the stomach, all right, through the abdominal wall, or even a jejunoscopy, which would be going right into jejunostomy, going into the intestines. Different types of food, because if the food is going to the stomach, then it can just be pureed food, right, from the blender and pushed in there because the stomach will digest. But if the stomach is being bypassed, then the food needs to be more refined, and it's just pure nutrition. Because then there's much less digestion that's going on, especially the proteins. And so if it's going into the intestines, then more refined nutrition needs to be inserted, all right? But my point about all this, that especially the PEG, since it's going to the stomach, and it's fairly simple surgery and can be maintained fairly easily, mostly by hygiene and so forth, the family or the person who is caring for the patient can prepare the food in a blender, right? And then push it right into the stomach directly. And to the point of even detail, even that food doesn't even need to taste good because it's not going through the mouth, but it needs to be nourishing. So, I mean, hypothetically, people could put into the blender steak, broccoli, and ice cream if you want, and blend it and push it into the stomach. It's all going to be digested, and the patient will not taste anything. All right. The idea is to nourish the patient. So you want a variety of food so that the patient is nourished. Okay, so that's the enteral nutrition. You also run across this sign in hospital setting or clinical setting, NPO, nothing per oral meaning the mouth, so nothing by mouth when we translate it into English. And you see NPO typically on top of the bed of the patient because this patient can aspirate, all right? And it could be for a number of reasons. It could be that the patient is being prepared for surgery, so nothing by mouth within 6 to 12 hours. The issue with having something on your stomach when you're going to surgery and anesthesia is that one can regurgitate unconsciously, subconsciously, and obviously if you're undergoing surgery, especially with general anesthesia, you don't want to regurgitate at that moment because, again, the patient can choke, all right? And so for a number of reasons, to prevent aspiration of pneumonia, they're having difficulty swallowing, or they're going into anesthesia. Their swallowing reflex is weakened, and so further tests need to be done. Or there is some issue with the GI tract. It could be an ulcer, it could be that the person is impacted. In other words, they haven't gone to the bathroom, they haven't had a bowel movement in several days, 2, 3, 4 days, 5 days. It's a critical situation, all right? That means that the stool has become too hard and the peristaltic movement. Peristalsis is a wave-like motion that occurs in smooth muscles, like the esophagus and the intestines. And you can think of a marble inside a water hose, and you keep squeezing that marble, you squeeze in the hose, and you move the marble forward, okay? That's peristaltic movement. It occurs also, for example, when we talked about beginning of life, on the fallopian tubes to move the embryo down into the uterus, peristalsis. Okay, so that can become weak, especially on the elderly. That reflex is weak, which, by the way, can be stimulated with water, okay? And I'll give you a little, just some practical tidbits here as we go along. One time, my brother and sister-in-law, we were visiting Guatemala in the colonial city, and well, I need to be careful with patient rights here. Anyway, I don't think she would mind. My sister-in-law was becoming constipated, and so in Guatemala, what do? We went to the pharmacist, and the pharmacist for medication to see if she could have a movement. And he said, no. What you're going to do is you're going to drink a glass of water, a tall glass of water, as hot as you can resist, as you wake up in the morning. First thing in the morning, drink a glass of hot water, okay? Don't burn yourself, but make it really, really warm, and just drink it slowly and stay put for a while. And that encourages peristalsis on the intestines, okay? It's the easiest remedy. It hydrates because that's precisely what that stool needs, to be hydrated and to stimulate the intestines into peristalsis, all right? It's amazing, it works like a charm. So if any of you know about elderly people, especially that they're getting impacted, try that first. First, you agree? Amazing, huh? Okay. Anyway, so let's see what we have. Right. So this is regards to enteral nutrition. All right. We'll pick up on the PEG a little bit more further down. But now, for completion, I want to talk a little bit about parenteral nutrition. And you notice is intravenous. It's an IV, right? You see another acronym as IV. This is not Roman numeral 4. It's IV in uppercase. And it's intravenous. Why don't we go into the arteries? After all, it's the arteries that are going to the body circulation, right? The arteries come out of the heart, veins go into the heart. So arteries are taking food, taking nutrition to all of the tissues of the body. And if we're trying to nourish the body, right? Why don't we go into arteries? The heart? Yes, but why would the bleeding be? So if arteries are coming out of the heart, then they are the ones that receive the heart pressure, right? Systole and diastole. So what happens is arterial blood is under pressure. That's why the arteries need to be elastic to expand when the heart contracts and take up that pressure, and then contract and push that pressure further down, eventually down into the capillaries. And that's another reason why we should really cut down on the salt, because sodium chloride hardens the arteries and we lose that elasticity, which means that then that will raise our blood pressure, elevate our blood pressure, which could eventually trigger a heart attack if that pressure keeps pushing back into the heart. Anyway, the point here is that if we were to put a needle into an artery and we have blood trying to push out, then it's going to clog the needle and it's going to cause hemorrhage and bleeding. So that's why we stay away from arteries. We go into veins. Venous circulation is the return circulation to the heart, and there's no high pressure there. It's low pressure. How does venous blood return to the heart? Because we don't have like little hearts in our capillaries that are pushing the blood back into the heart, right? And even when we are standing or upright, it's even going against gravity, and it needs to come back into the heart, the blood. Well, it's done passively by muscle movement, and that's why the veins are intertwined through our musculature, especially skeletal muscle, the muscles that we move voluntarily, all right? And the movement of the muscles is what pushes circulation back into the heart through the veins, number one. Number two, the veins also have little valves on them that are one-way valves. For example, if you do this to your arm and you push it down and you make, you see all those little bumps? These are veins, and those bumps are little valves. The valves are one way, so that once the blood goes through, it will not reflux, it will go back. And that's how all the blood is being pushed back into the heart through the veins. So it's blood, but it's two different mechanisms of circulation, right? And so we go into the vein, then the intravenous. And there you have two types according to the amount of nutrition that is being pumped into the body, either partial parenteral nutrition or total parenteral nutrition. And again, the acronyms that you see there is PPN for partial, and TPN, which is the most typical one, TPN for total parenteral nutrition, all right? In other words, that the patient is getting all the nourishment, all the minerals, electrolytes, everything else that the patient needs for staying alive. So again, a little diagram on ports of entry, jugular, the subclavian underneath the clavicle. The clavicle is this bone over here on the sides of the neck, right? So these are just ports of entry, also on the arms, or the femoral veins on the inside next to the groin. Those are various ports of entry for venous circulation. And these little tubes then hang out like that, and that's the port. And then a line, which needs to be maintained clean and so forth. And now directly, the physician, the nurse, can come in here and place the needle that is needed either for hydration, glucose saline solution, or the actual parenteral nutrition, either partial or total. Okay. Now let's look a little bit at some advantages and disadvantages here, because TPN solutions, they're concentrated, they're thickened, and therefore they can cause clots inside the circulatory system. And this central line, central catheter, is also, if it gets infected, it's a problem for the patient, right? And so they have to be maintained very clean and so forth. And when a patient has a functioning GI tract, then parenteral nutrition is not used. Some disadvantages, they can cause more complications. In other words, you're feeding the patient with nutrients, may be difficult to assimilate, and it can cause more medical complications. So they try to stay away from TPN unless it's the only final alternative to feed the patient. Also, what happens is with TPN or PPN is that the digestive tract then, because it's not being used, becomes lazy. And that peristalsis reflex may be lost further for the patient. So it's a two-edged sword, okay? It's similar to the lungs and the vent. If we keep the patient on the vent for too long, the lungs get lazy and they say, if I'm getting oxygen for free, with pressure, why should I bother breathing? Okay, remember, nature is economic, so it's always trying to save energy. And all these movements are energetically expensive. They take up ATPs, they take up energy. So TPN is not the preferred option, right? Especially if the GI tract is working, then typically the patient will be put on a peg if the patient needs to be maintained long-term. All right, so let's look for a moment at this peg. Again, going back, nutrition and hydration in principle are ordinary means of life support, ordinary means, but there are sometimes when it becomes extraordinary. And we're going to look at when does nutrition and hydration become extraordinary. Because we're going to look at the case of Terry Schiavo in a minute, I want you to understand well how the peg works, because it's the most common one. And even though it looks a little impressive to have basically a rubber tube going in through the abdomen into the person's body, here's an actual photograph. It's a navel there for reference. These are just moles that are inconsequential. There's nothing wrong here in the skin, essentially. And there's the peg. It has this little bib on the outside, and then there's like a little balloon on the inside, so it doesn't pull out by itself. Follow? And that's the endoscopy. Is the clinician will put a camera literally down through the esophagus into the stomach to see what they're doing there. And then it just has a port that needs to be kept clean. And it's a large bore syringe or a plunger where the food is placed and then just plunged down slowly into the stomach. So it's a fairly simple, once it's inserted, simple way of maintaining the patient nourished and hydrated. And typically the food is hydrated a lot so that it's a single event for nutrition and hydration together. But if the patient needs more liquid, you can just put straight up liquid down the same peg. Yes.
How does it be, how do they keep it clean so no infection gets in there?
Right, just regular hygiene, soap and water, and obviously on the outside. The inside, this area in here is sterile, plus keep in mind that the stomach has a pH of about 1.5 or 2, all right? So it's very acidic in there, and that essentially keeps the inside of the peg clean. The concern is mostly over here to keep this area clean also. And I don't know, maybe Nurse Allen, you can tell us, can it be clamped here periodically, the tube clamp, and this port either cleaned, washed, like in the sink, or replaced, disposable?
Yeah, I mean, the tube is not removed. You see the cap, so that's what.
Right.
That's how, it's supposed
Sealed.
to be kept covered.
Uh-huh.
To avoid bacteria going in.
Right.
It's one tube, and
Mm-hmm.
because when you
Oh,
have
okay.
layers of disconnection,
Yes.
you are more susceptible to infection.
To infection, yes.
But regardless of the daily cleaning, remember there's bacteria on our skin all the time.
Yes.
And hospital in itself, the bugs are everywhere. So
Mm-hmm.
the patient, and because the patient's immune system are usually already so compromised, they are much more susceptible to infection. But
Yeah.
the tube can last for a very long time, but there's no guarantee that they won't get infection because they are just so highly at risk already, just being.
Yes. So it's a delicate situation, but at the end of the day, the food that we normally eat, even it's not sterile, all right, it's full of bacteria. And again, most of that bacteria is digested in the stomach. But the point about the PEG is that essentially it can be maintained for years, even decades, on a patient who is in a vegetative state. And that's what we'll see in the case of Terry Scheibe in a few minutes, okay? All right, so with regards to the bioethical analysis itself, I need to switch over now to the ERDs, the ethical and religious directives. There are actually 3 directives that speak directly to this issue, 56, 57, and 58. So 56 essentially talks about proportionate or ordinary means of life support. There is moral, ethical obligation to maintain ordinary means of life support, which in principle is nutrition, hydration, shelter, right? The care that I talked about earlier. But then 57 speaks about that there is no moral obligation to use extraordinary or disproportionate means of life support. Again, the challenge here, reviewing from previous lectures, is that this terminology, extraordinary or disproportionate, may not be medical clinical terminology. It's bioethical terminology, and we need to bridge that gap with the clinicians so that the patient or the loved ones, if the patient is unconscious, everybody understands what we're talking about, right? Ordinary versus extraordinary means of life support. Also, the fact that extraordinary means of life support do not obligate morally, ethically, doesn't mean that they have to be avoided by all means. Okay, either the patient, if the patient is conscious, or the next of kin, whoever is deciding on the behalf of the patient, the proxy, may well choose disproportionate means or extraordinary means, but they're not obligated morally. Sometimes I've seen in students when they do the summary of the write-up is that they say, well, if it's disproportionate, then they have to be like banned, the patient or the proxy may not decide to use extraordinary means. It has to be disallowed, and that's not the case, okay? It could be sometimes that extraordinary means are used temporarily because the prognosis is good, all right? There's a good hope of recovery, and therefore temporarily, the patient may need to be like on a vent that is substituting the lungs and so forth, or even dialysis if there's a good hope of receiving a kidney on the list, all right? So, but it doesn't obligate morally. That's the bottom line. Then, oh yes, I also want to mention here, notice that it also defines, in the same directive, it defines what they're talking about proportionate or disproportionate, okay? In the patient's judgment, so keep this in mind because really the patient decides what's reasonable, what should be the best option for the patient, okay? Then finally, 58 speaks directly to nutrition and hydration. There should be a presumption in favor of providing nutrition and hydration to all patients, including patients who require medically assisted nutrition and hydration. You see, this medically assisted, which could be either enteral or parenteral, doesn't mean by itself that it becomes disproportionate, all right? It may be assisted, so it's the nutrition and the hydration are provided artificially, but that doesn't make it in itself disproportionate. So it'd be artificial, but ordinary. As long as it is sufficient benefit to outweigh the burdens to the patient. Another challenging issue with the PEG, for example, with elderly, is that no one is accustomed to having a tube right into their stomach, right? A tube through the walls of the stomach. So patients, especially if they're disoriented, they try to pull it out, and that's not a good thing. So then the next step would be to tie the patient down to the bed, which is even a worse scenario. Now you got a patient who has a PEG and is tied to the bed and they're becoming anxious, and it's a big to-do. So for the elderly in particular, or if the patient is disoriented, the PEG can be a real challenge, all right? Okay, so to recap, in principle, nutrition and hydration are ordinary means of life support, but that little word in principle means that there are exceptions, okay? And the exceptions come down to two, essentially, to two. Either when the nutrition and the hydration are no longer being assimilated into the body, absorbed or assimilated, or if the nutrition and hydration, the means of nutrition and hydration are an excessive burden to the patient, to the dying patient, okay? Not to the family around or to the care or to the next of kin, but to the patient herself or himself. So let's look a little bit in more detail each one of these two exceptions, because it's important to understand them and to try to apply them to real life, not just theoretically, because sooner or later we're going to encounter someone, maybe a family member, a relative, a loved one, or ourselves who need this kind of direction, okay? Absorbed or assimilated. Absorption is mostly at the level of the intestines. In other words, the intestines absorb the nutrients into the circulatory system. And then assimilation is at the level of the tissue, if the organs are actually assimilating that nutrition or not, okay? Particularly vital organs. So if the intestines are no longer absorbing the food, well, the intestines are vital organs. It means that that patient is dying. It may be subtle, but it's real. The death process has begun, all right? And there's no obligation to substitute vital organs, okay? Assist, yes, but not substitute. Or at the other end of the circulatory system, if that nutrition and hydration is not being assimilated by the organs, especially vital organs, it could be the liver, it could be other organs, right? It's not assimilated, then it also means that that patient is dying imminently, and there's no longer an obligation to supply the nutrition or the hydration. So it's delicate, but here's where we need the expertise precisely of the clinicians to tell us if this nutrition or hydration is being assimilated or absorbed by the patient or not. So this is more on the physical, physiological side of the patient. On the more psychological side is the issue of burden and excessive burden, okay? Because what could be a burden for me may not be a burden for you. We have, just like we have different tolerance to pain and suffering, we also have different tolerance to the perception of receiving this artificial nutrition or hydration. Of course, if the patient is being unreasonable, right, then we should try to dialogue with that patient and communicate with the patient and encourage the patient to take this nutrition or hydration, even if it's administered artificially, because it's for their good. They have a good prognosis, they have a positive prognosis of recovery, and therefore they should be encouraged. But at the end of the day, the patient decides. The patient decides. And if in the estimation of the patient, this is an excessive burden, then that patient can truly be disconnected in good conscience. You follow? And then, of course, if the patient is disconnected from nutrition and hydration, then death is not far. Okay. All right. Now, let's apply this to a case here in Florida. Let me stop for a moment. Questions, comments? All right. Well, let's see how well we've learned the theory. Because there was a case here in Florida precisely. How many of you have ever heard of Terry Schiavo? Yes? All right, Rogelio. Okay, of course, Nurse Allen. Yes. Chris, you have?
Yeah, but I don't really know too much about it.
Sure. Okay, excellent. Well, after today, you'll know much more. Let's see. Yes, Terry was a very challenging and tragic case that occurred here in Florida because she was young and healthy, and then she had an event and ended up being in a vegetative state for years, for decades. So there's a timeline that I need to download here for a moment. I think I had sent you the timeline. Yeah. Okay, here we go. So let's follow this timeline for a little bit. Possibly one of the most challenging cases that we can encounter toward end of life, especially when they're not really elderly people, okay, but they're young. Terry was born in 1963. She came from a Catholic family and living up in Pennsylvania. Her maiden name is Schindler, Schindler. And then when she was 20 years old, she married. She married Michael Schiavo, who was just about a year older than her. Now, I want to say a little something about the last name of Michael, because you see the predicament that he had. And this name in English is pronounced Schiavo. I've heard it because I was here in Miami doing bioethics when this case was going on over the millennium from the 90s into the 2000s. And you hear it pronounced many different ways. He was in the news for months, sometimes maybe even years. But I want to tell you that this is it's an Italian last name, and you know my dad was Italian. And just like my name is written C-I-O-F-F-I, but it's pronounced Cioffi, right? So C-I is pronounced C-H in Italian, whereas C-H is pronounced K. In other words, it's a soft C and hard C, all right? So C-I is pronounced with a soft C, which is ch, but C-H is pronounced like a hard C, which is like a K. So really his name is pronounced Schiavo. In Italian, it's Schiavo. And in Spanish, we have a certain advantage because these are Romance languages. And Schiavo in Italian, in Spanish is esclavo, in other words, slave. I find it so ironic and so gripping that his last name actually means slave in Italian. in the etymology of the word. And you see, in my opinion, he kind of became a slave to himself in the process of what happened to him as husband of Terry. So let's move forward. 6 years into the marriage, so they moved down to Florida because her parents, apparently they were all getting along very well originally, Terry and Michael and the parents of Terry. The parents had retired and moved down to Florida, to the West Coast, and so Terry and Michael moved down to be next, close to her parents. In fact, I think they were actually living together. No, at the time she collapsed, they were not living together. Terry and Michael had their own apartment or condo, and the Schindlers were nearby, same town. Anyway, after 6 years into the marriage, in the middle of the night, Terry collapses, all right? And she had a heart attack. It's considered that she had some kind of a potassium imbalance. And so her heart failed, and she was actually unconscious for several hours. She collapsed in the middle of the night sometime, and it was only close to dawn that Michael says that he found her on the floor, all right, and then called rescue. And so under emergency, she was taken to the nearest hospital. It turns out that she had been without oxygen for some time. That is not known exactly. We talked about hypoxia and anoxia previously. And so her brain was severely damaged by lack of oxygen. All right, she's unconscious. And under emergency, she's connected to a peg. In the hope that, because they didn't know, she would wake up soon. Remember, we talked about coma and PVS also. So this is all under emergency. She's on a peg. She doesn't recover. She doesn't regain consciousness. The days turn into weeks and the weeks turn into months. So about 3 months after being in a peg, but not a vent. So she's breathing on her own and her heart is beating on its own, all right? All she needs is nutrition and hydration. About 3 months in, there's no sign of recovery, so she's transferred to a rehabilitation center where they start aggressive rehabilitation to see if they can get to wake her up. She's in her 20s, you know, and it's a desperate situation. Michael is appointed guardian officially, even though he's already the proxy by reason of marriage. So automatically he's the proxy, but he's also awarded guardianship by the courts. And at that time, the parents do not object, all right? They're still getting along and so forth. As it progresses, Terry has up and down, she remains unconscious, and she goes back to another hospital for rehabilitation efforts. It doesn't work. At some point, the Schindlers take her home and try to just maintain her with a feeding tube, with a peg, but it's overwhelming, so they have to put her back into the hospital or nursing facility. And now the months start turning into years. You notice that she had a collapse in 1990. That year of 1990 is very traumatizing. Even Michael takes her to California for some kind of experimental brain stimulation treatment that did not work. So Michael brings her back to Florida again, to the West Coast of Florida. And Terry is put in another facility in the town of Brandon there, where she has 24-hour skilled care because either Michael or the Schindlers, her parents, are unable really to care for her 24 hours, all right? But she's in a vegetative state at this point. The only thing she has is the peg. She's breathing on her own, her heart is beating on its own, so she's not dead, okay? But she's in PVS. Now, there's a malpractice suit. Here comes the money. There's a malpractice suit that is awarded. Two of them, first they get $250,000, and then they get over $1 million with two malpractice suits, okay? And this money, the bulk of it is $750,000 is in an account for Terry's care, health care. Now, while Terry's alive, that money needs to go for her health care. If Terry dies, then who inherits? Then Michael inherits, the husband, because they're not divorced. So the money enters into the picture, big money. The Schindlers want to have a part of the award because they claim that they're also caring for their daughter, so they want part of the award. Now the courts come in. It starts going back and forth into the courts. At some point, Michael, I'm gonna try to shorten a little bit. Michael wants to have the peg disconnected, okay? What is his claim? So first of all, there was no written anything from Terry or Michael with regards to a DNR, with regards to a living will that we talked about previously, and Nurse Allen will pick up more on that. But basically, there was no documentation. But there was a conversation that Michael claims. Of course, Terry cannot speak on her own. And Michael claims that one time they were at a restaurant having dinner, and the conversation came up somehow about vegetative state and if Terry or Michael wanted to live that way. And Michael claims that Terry said, I would not want to live that way in a vegetative state. And now she is in that vegetative state, okay? So that's his claim. That's the only thing we have to go by, because it was just the two of them at the restaurant talking to each other in a private, personal conversation. So Michael wants the peg disconnected. There is the aura that if Terry dies, then he inherits the money, all right? But he hasn't divorced her. So he hasn't divorced her, so he has the right to the inheritance. In the meantime, sometimes in the 90s, Michael has actually started another relationship with another woman without divorcing Terry. And again, this is public record. At some point, he is actually open about that relationship. The name of the lady is here. Jody Shentonzi. They even have a child together. They're seen in public. Him, Michael, and Jody, and the kid in public places in the same town. He's still married. He hasn't divorced her. Okay. Now his claim is that he at some point realizes that Terry is not coming back, so he moves on with his life. Meaning he falls in love with another woman and has a relationship, but he doesn't divorce Terry because Michael claims that he wanted to make sure that Terry's wishes were followed through, that Terry's wishes were complied with, which is, I wouldn't want to live this way. So Terry is intent on disconnecting, Michael is intent on disconnecting the peg because those were Terry's wishes. Okay, so that's his claim. If he divorces, of course, the ones who are going to take over are the parents. The parents were kind of in a denial state that, of course, it's easier for us to look at it, years later and back. But the parents, here's their 20-year-old, only child, beautiful lady, very healthy before the marriage. So the Schindlers, the parents, don't want to lose hope that Terry is PVS and is not coming back, that she has severe brain damage, all right? They're also very devout Catholics, and so it becomes a pro-life issue, just like the beginning of life, the end of life. And now this is getting out to the public because the press has gotten a hold of it. All the court documents are public documents. All the records, the testimonies and all this, those are all public documents. The press gets into it, reporters are reporting this, and press, typically secular press, is opportunistic, and they scale it up to make it sensational, and it's newsworthy, it's selling, all right, because the drama of Terry in bed with a peg for years now. Michael wants to disconnect her, the parents don't want to let her go, and it's a back and forth. So it goes into the court process. Judge Greer here in Florida grants the judges in favor of Michael, essentially, because he is, see, Judge Greer has to go by the law. And Michael is the husband of this woman. Infidelity aside, you know, the law doesn't pass, civil law doesn't pass judgment on the morality or the ethics. When was the last time you see someone getting arrested for infidelity, right? For adultery. It's happening, but they don't get arrested. It used to be in the books, actually. It used to be in the law, civil law, but it's not enforceable, right? So there's a background going on. And the motivation aside, the judge only has to go on the legal aspect that Michael is the husband, legitimate, and therefore he decides he speaks on her behalf. The Schindlers, of course, appealed that judgment. And so back and forth, you know, their legal processes that all the appeals have to be exhausted. And the appeals go from one court to another, and they keep going higher and higher. Eventually, it hits the Supreme Court of the state of Florida, because all the local courts and district courts, all the appeals are exhausted. Michael wants to disconnect her. The Schindlers want to keep her connected. And so it's a legal thing, back and forth. Yes, at some point, the Schindlers asked for a swallow test to see in desperation if Terry can swallow, so that if she's disconnected, she can swallow, or if she cannot swallow, then there is the clinical aspect that she needs to stay connected in order to stay alive, because she's not dead, she's not dying, her heart is beating, and so that's why the brain stem is fully functional, right? Remember the distinction? All right, so the swallow test is denied by courts because it goes against the interests of Michael or the interests of Terry. So going back and forth. In the meantime, there is, so Judge Greer orders the removal of the peg. Here is 2001, okay? She collapsed when? In 1990. Okay? The collapse was in 1990. So the court issues, here is 11 years later, in a peg, in bed, in PVS. So yes, it can be maintained healthily, clean, and so forth, with a lot of care. So the first peg is, the peg is removed the first time in 2001. But immediately the Schindlers, under some kind of an emergency rule, managed to get the peg reinstated 3 days later by another judge, Judge Casada. Reverses the order of George Greer, and 3 days later, so this time, the first time, she was only without NH for 3 days. All right, peg is reinserted. Michael continues his process of appeals, back and forth. At that time, the governor was George W. Bush, all right? Which, you know, it was a pro-life administration. So all this takes on the pro-life aura that if Terry is disconnected, then it was euthanasia, okay? And so it takes that whole aspect, and George W. Bush tries to intercede on behalf of the Schindlers and on behalf of Terry. And so he even gets the Florida legislature to carve out a specific law called Terry's Law, right? That forbade the disconnecting of these kind of patients, forbade the pulling out the tube. Of course, Michael questions the constitutionality of that law, of that legislature that is so particular and carved for one individual case law. So that's when it moved to the Florida Supreme Court. The Florida Supreme Court, sorry, I got the Bush brothers confused. It was Jeb Bush was the governor, and his brother was the president. Okay, his brother was the president. So Jeb gets W to try to get the Supreme Court of the United States to hear the case. Okay, and the Supreme Court refuses to hear the case, the federal Supreme Court, all right, which is the highest court of the land. They send it back to the state. They send it back to the state. They refuse to hear the case. So it's back in the state, back and forth. In the meantime, the Schindlers go to the Vatican, and they actually manage to have an audience with John Paul II. All right, and John Paul II intervenes now. What's happening? There's after the back and forth with the governor, the peg is removed for a second time. Now we're in 2003, and this time the peg stayed out for a week and then reinserted again when Jeb Bush manages to get that law, Terry's Law, which is House Bill 35E, all right? And so the peg is reinserted for the second time, a week later. The Schindlers go to the Vatican. They have an audience with the Pope. It turns out that John Paul II at that time happens to be having is addressing, there's a World Congress of Catholic physicians on end-of-life issues, and it's happening in the Vatican, and he's addressing that audience. And he states that's where he makes a statement that in principle, nutrition and hydration are ordinary means, even if they have to be administered artificially. You see, even if they have to be administered through some kind, either enteral or parenteral, specifically the PEG. So in other words, the fact that nutrition and hydration are being administered artificially doesn't make them by itself extraordinary. All right, and so that's the challenge. In other words, the PEG, even though it's certainly artificially, because we normally don't eat through a PEG, right? Even though it's artificial, that in itself doesn't mean that it's extraordinary. It could be ordinary, and if it's ordinary, then it obligates. Nutrition and hydration, in principle, obligates. Well, so here's the impasse. All right. At some point, all of the legal proceedings are exhausted between Terry's parents and Terry's husband. You can read more details on the timeline here, but I want to get down finally to the third time that they removed the PEG by court order. And that will be the last time. It'll be in yellow coming up here. Here we go. The third removal in 2005. She collapsed in 1990. So at this point, she's been 15 years in bed with a PEG in PBS, and 3 times the PEG has been removed. This is the third time at this point, and she's in a home, she's in a nursing home, and the press has gotten out over the months and years, all right, because every time there's more drama going on, going to the Supreme Court of the United States, getting the president involved, going to the Vatican, getting the Pope involved. So you can imagine the world press that occurred on this. And so there are manifestations that are going on. Larger and larger groups of people are showing up in front of the nursing home, either pro Terry or pro Michael, right? And there are manifestations going on. At some point, there's tiff between these two groups. Dozens, hundreds of people are showing up. The police have to intervene. At some point, even Jeb Bush, I think, was even considering the National Guard. And there was a barrier that had to be set of a periphery of a safety zone, and everyone was barred from coming to that area by law. Okay, so it became a huge big to-do, especially for the third disconnection, because now this means that if she's disconnected from the PEG, what happens? She starts dying of malnutrition and dehydration, right? And we also talked about dying from malnutrition and dehydration. And whereas we could last maybe up to a month without food, depending on how plump we are, and because the body goes into self-digestion, self-consumption, starts first digesting the fat, then digesting the muscle tissue of our body until we literally get down to skin and bones, right? But that may take some time, several weeks. But we die of dehydration much sooner because the kidneys shut down at some point. 2, 3, 4, 5 days without water, the kidneys are going to shut down, right? So we die of dehydration typically much sooner than we die of malnutrition. And yet, Terry lasted from March 18 without a peg to March 31st. So at least 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, just consuming. And in the meantime, the drama of all the people who were the ones who were in favor of Michael to let her die, the ones who were in favor of the Schindlers to reconnect her because she's starving to death and she's dehydrating to death, and she really was consumed in bed down to bare minimum. Photographers were banned, of course, and it was very, very challenging. But she finally died on March 31st. Okay? So now her body is transferred to the coroner's office for an autopsy, and the pathologist determines, medical examiner, that her brain was indeed beyond repair. The damage to the neurons was excessive, and there was no hope of recovery from that vegetative state. And therefore, really, the Schindlers at the end of the day did not have a case that she was going to recover. So, to disconnect or not to disconnect. There is, of course, the complexity that Michael was already having another relationship, even though he was still married to Terry. There is the issue of the inheritance of the money. But if we try to bracket that and focus on the action itself, should Terry have been disconnected or not? I would not want to have lived that way. Michael claims were her words. But even if she did not say that, let's say that we are Terry and we are connected this way. Would we want to live that way?
I'd just like to add,
Please.
I attended a conference, shortly after she died of Florida bioethics.
Yes.
And the neurologist who cared for her showed us pictures of her brain, what her normal brain is and what her brain was when she died.
Yes.
And it was like this, so shrunken. So, so that supports the disproportion portion, right?
Right, exactly.
There is no hope.
There is no hope. It's abysmal.
Do we prolong the suffering? Her body is lying there, but I can tell you, they didn't talk about it, but being a nurse for 44 years, no matter how you try to turn every 2 hours, I'm sure she had bed sores.
Right.
It's like
that
body is suffering.
Right.
From that perspective, there is clearly no hope that this brain, a brain this size, is ever gonna return to a brain this size. So I think that's
exactly
where we need to process, and we'll talk a little bit when we get into my session, is thinking ahead, because all of this could have been avoided if Terry had the conversation while she was alive and well, and clearly shared with her entire family what she would or would not want at the end of time. The governor, she did not need a governor to step in. We need to be the ones in control of our healthcare. And the only way we can is to have these conversations while we're alive and well.
Exactly.
So this is a perfect case to lead into the importance of
Advanced directives.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So
Absolutely.
it really was a sad case.
It was, it's an tragic. So you were here also in Florida at that time practicing. So, you know, it was gripping and it went on for years.
Right after this case,
Mm-hmm.
we got so many phone calls
Yes.
in our office. I went to, churches. Everybody
Right.
wanted us to come
Mm-hmm.
to their location.
Right.
Because they're like, we don't want this to happen to us. So
Exactly.
we had a real influx of phone calls where people wanted to learn more about what can they do to avoid this happening to them.
Exactly.
So we were out there,
Mm-hmm.
We went to so many churches,
Mm-hmm.
so many different groups.
Groups,
wanted us to come and talk to
yes.
them, and
Community groups,
yeah,
community centers,
yeah,
right?
Community centers,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of different churches, and
Yes.
that's where we really started to doing a lot more community education. But
Exactly.
it was following her case.
Exactly. If there was ever a silver lining in such a tragedy, is that it raised tremendous awareness of end-of-life issues. And I can tell you, there was a before and an after with regards to Terry, because before, it was mostly the beginning of life issues. And pro-life, I've been in pro-life for 40 years. It was a lot of focus on the beginning of life issues and the increasing technology that was impinging on beginning of life, like we've seen and so forth. But then this shifted the focus to end of life issues. And even to this day, in any kind of bioethics center or consultation, I can tell you the bulk of the consults are for end of life issues, as opposed to beginning of life. Okay, so it really marked a before and an after. Okay, so we normally take a little break now to try to thaw out. But questions or comments before we
want to
go?
make sure that we have it clear, so it's
Yes,
ordinary means, even if it's artificially inserted. right?
yes,
But when does it become extraordinary?
exactly. That is the key.
Yeah.
Exactly. That is the key question, the when, okay? But keep in mind, Directive 58 from the Catholic perspective is in the estimation of the patient. In the estimation of the patient, in this case, Terry, it has become an excessive burden, all right? Now, Terry cannot speak on her own. So whoever is the proxy. By law, it was Michael. So Michael was speaking on her behalf, regardless of what other behavior he was showing with regards to Terry. Maybe there was a certain, at least in my personal opinion, there was an inconsistency. If he wants to care for Terry's well-being, why is he in an open relationship with another woman, being Catholic and having been married in the Catholic Church and everything else? So that's the challenge there, but still, the lawyers and the judges, they have to go by what the law is, right? So, but the bottom line here, the key is in the estimation of the patient. And when the patient cannot decide, right, when the patient cannot decide, then the proxy needs to decide. And that's when we assign a proxy in the living will or in the form, the Declaration of Life and Death, we make sure that we have conversation with that proxy and let them know what our wishes are. It's what Nurse Allen is saying. I want to give one more little detail that also made it kind of difficult, especially from the Schindlers who didn't necessarily have a medical background. There's something called as tracking. It's called tracking. People who are in PVS are known, if you walk into the room and walk across the room, they will track you with their eyes, okay? The eyes can track, but it's an automatic movement of the eye. It doesn't mean that there's consciousness. And Terry would do this tracking on and off to people who walk into her room. So they thought, it gave the impression that maybe she's regaining some kind of consciousness because look, she's looking at me. But no, it's just an automatic reflex of the eye that is used to following movement automatically, because the eye is a very, very complex organ, all right? So that tracking also didn't help any with regards to her real medical situation. All right? We want to, oh, absolutely, yeah, that's what, exactly. This is a good little break here. Absolutely. So let's see. Okay, so it's 11:10. Let's come back at try to make it by 11:20 if possible. 10, 15 minutes. All right, and then we'll be back. So let me pause the recording. Okay, Chris. So
Okay, perfect.
what we do
All
is
right.
we turn off
The lights are lit up. Okay, thank you.
visible on the screen.
All right, so it truly is an honor and a privilege to join you here this morning. What you have in front of you is a packet. I just want to quickly share with you that this is a national initiative, the Conversation Project, and in the end, in your packet, there is a list of the various websites, but this is a national initiative called the Conversation Project, and National Healthcare Decision Day is celebrated on April 14th every year. And so it's an IHI Institute project that's been going on for several years, and we have just partnered with them for the past 5 years. And the goal is really to go out and educate the public on the importance of having the conversation about advanced healthcare planning. So this is a conversation guide. So my PowerPoint is really just outlining the guide. The various steps is how do I prepare? How do I have the conversation? So you can go on the website and there, it's in different languages. I also brought a couple of Spanish packets in case, but our focus today is really focusing on the Catholic conversation, okay? That website is just general conversation, but today our focus will be on the Catholic conversation. So I brought you the Catholic document, which is from our Catholic document copies. And you also have in your packet something called a Dear Doctor letter. So there are various ways that we can communicate, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then this orange sheet will be a little exercise we're going to do in a minute. All right, so we're going to get started. So again, I've introduced myself, and I'm Rose Allen, Director of our Bioethics, and truly a privilege to be here. So I really wanted to start because we've been living in this COVID world for over a year now. And I don't know if any of you have experienced or if you know of people who have died from COVID. You know, you may know friends or family. When we look at the statistics, which I just pulled up as of April 23rd, over 400,000 cases of COVID in just Miami-Dade alone, and over 6,000 people have died. Statewide, we've had over 2 million people who have had COVID, and the death rate has been over 34,000. So while we are being told to prepare, social distance, wear masks, do your vaccines, this whole death incidents that we've lived with for over a year really has brought to light, what else should I be doing, right? Because we've been a death-denying society. But as Catholic Christians, we know that our life here is temporary, right? And every day we get up and we're trying to live the life of Jesus, right? Knowing that one day we're going to gloriously be with him. But that transition means we're going to have to die. So death should be something we should embrace because none of us know when it's going to happen to us. Someone once said to me, from the day we're born, we're death eligible. And it's right? unfortunately, in the hospital, we see death at all ages. So even with COVID, we've had young people die in our hospitals. So it's important, you know, we're planning for college, we're planning for our career, but planning for your health care is the best gift that we can give our family and ourselves. So I'd like you to journey with me over this short time that we spend together, because it's important for us to prepare for ourselves as well as the people that are in our lives. And the best way for us to go and have that conversation with our family and friends is for us to first think of it ourselves and walk ourselves through. So I'd like you to just journey with me through this. And I'd like you to think about what would be most important if you became very sick with COVID-19 or have a serious illness. So during this time, we're gonna walk through those steps of having our own conversation, because that's what I wanna empower you to do first before you go out there and start talking with other people, okay? So think about, ponder as we're going through this exercise, what would be most important to you? What are you most worried about? And what is helping you through the difficult times? Like this whole pandemic period, just kind of process some of those questions. So my next question to you is, have you had the conversation? Have any of you been in a situation where you've either had to make decisions for family members? You've had family members who were seriously sick and you've been around those who have had to make decisions? Would you mind sharing?
5 years ago, when I came to the States, I came because my aunt was diagnosed with a stage 4 cancer.
I'm so
And
sorry.
she had, I was with her during the process. And basically she was undergoing to chemos, but there were trial chemos. There were not intended to cure her, but to help her for some time.
Palliative
Yes.
chemo.
At the end of the day, after a series of chemo, she fell, she broke her hips. They have to stop the treatment. And so the cancer grew up like very fast.
Yeah.
And she had the position of the tumor was in the middle of the pancreas area.
Pancreatic,
Yes,
yeah.
it was a pancreatic cancer.
Yeah.
So she had, it grew up so fast that it blocked the conduits for the intestine. So she started, she couldn't eat no more.
Right.
Well, my cousins and they had the conversation, and I was there when they decided that she would like to have palliative care. She didn't want to be connected or have RCP. And so she passed away at home with us.
So she made the decision herself. Yeah. And did you find that less burdensome when she could make the decision herself?
Yes.
Just imagine if she wasn't able to, and then that responsibility was on the family, and the family didn't know what she would have wanted. That is why we're having these talks, because it's the best gift we can give our loved one is when we tell them ahead of time, what is it that I would want? What matters most to you through life and through till the end? It's just having those conversations casually, so important. So thank you for sharing your story. So why does planning matter? Because 50 to 70% of patients who come to our hospitals are unable to speak for themselves. 50 to 70% of people who are in our hospital and at the end of life are unable to speak, okay? But only less than 25% have had the conversation or have their wishes known by family. Okay? So the best gift we could give our loved ones is having these end-of-life conversations while we're healthy and well. It takes the burden off your family. Perfect example that was given to us. And we'll talk a little bit as we go through. When the patient doesn't have an advance directive, how do we make decisions, or how are decisions made while they're in the hospital? So from a patient rights standpoint, because as the ethics team, we are there to advocate for the patient's wishes, okay? And we'll talk a little bit when we get to a living will. What is a living will? And I'll touch a little bit again on Terry Schiavo's case. So by you planning ahead, by you sharing your wishes, you are remaining in control of your life, even when you are not able to speak for yourself, because by you putting it in writing, we have to honor your wishes. And whoever you chose to be your decision maker legally should not be changing your wishes. And the law supports that we can take a surrogate to court if we have the patient's living will that's clearly stating what the patient would have wanted, and they're wanting to make decisions that are not consistent with a patient's wishes. So the law protects that vulnerable, incapacitated patient. So you remain in control of your healthcare through till the end. So this is just a short reflection. The dignity of this life is linked not only to its beginning, to the fact that it comes from God, but also to its final end, to its destiny of fellowship with God in knowledge and love of Him. And this is the Evangelium Vitae, number 38. So it's just not being afraid of death and knowing that this life is temporary, and every day we're living it to the fullest to be like Christ, because we're gloriously waiting for that day. And so being able to talk about it, what do I want? What would I want at the end? Am I okay? And from a patient rights standpoint, what I encourage, because there are patients who are okay wanting their life prolonged on life support. But if those are your wishes, it's important to put it in writing. And others will say, when there's no hope, then I don't want my life prolonged. So it's really you as an individual, because we're all very different, right? So it's encouraging everyone to clearly state their wish. So how do we get ready? We get ready by thinking about it. So when you're about to approach family and friends, they may not be ready. They may have things they want to address, finances, they may be busy taking care of other people. People may want to process it. So it's not just filling out a document, it's really thinking and discerning your values. So we're going to spend a little time talking about that. So the first step is really getting ready. So because we're in this session now, we're going to assume that you guys are ready. So the next step is discerning your values. So what does that mean? It really means sitting and thinking about it. So we're going to spend a little time just processing what that means, and that's the exercise. So once you've discerned your values, what's really most important to you? It's things you really have to stop and think about. Then the next step is, who am I going to discuss this with, right? And then the very last step is completing the documentation. All right, so we're going to just go through these steps now. So we're going to spend a little time. I know Father Shofi did a phenomenal job in talking a little bit about, artificial nutrition and hydration. But again, in the beginning, I asked you to think of yourself if you had COVID-19 and were seriously ill, or you had some kind of terminal condition, what you would or would not want. So under the ethical and religious directives for Catholic healthcare, we have clear ethical Catholic values here. So the first, as Father Shofi said earlier, we have a duty. We have a duty to preserve our life and to use it to the glory of God. So preservation of life is our first and foremost values, right? However, the duty to preserve life is not absolute. So it's morally acceptable to forego extraordinary measures if they are ineffectively beneficial or excessively burdensome. And Father Shofi went over that. He spoke about the medically assisted nutrition and hydration. It's considered normal care and a natural means of preserving life, okay? So the persistent vegetative patient is considered a person, and therefore we must provide artificial nutrition and hydration because that is part of preserving life. However, medically assisted nutrition and hydration becomes morally optional when they cannot reasonably be expected to prolong life or is excessively burdensome for the patient or causes significant physical harm. And this is very clear in our directives. This booklet that says Understanding Catholic Declaration, if you open it up on page 2, there's a section that says Considering Benefits and Burden. So we have a moral obligation, and physicians' primary duty is to provide care that is of more benefit than is causing harm. So considering benefits and burden, a person has a moral obligation to use ordinary or proportionate means of preserving his or her life. Proportionate means, and those that in the judgment of the patient. So again, it's the patient's wish. If the patient feels this treatment is too burdensome, like her aunt, they have a right to say, I no longer want this. And interestingly, it also says, in the judgment of the patient offers a reasonable hope of benefit and does not entail an excessive burden or impose excessive expense on my family or my community. So a person may forego extraordinary or disproportionate means of preserving life. Disproportionate means are those that in the patient's judgment do not offer a reasonable hope of benefit. Again, entails excessive burden, not only to the patient, but in this case, they're even considering their family. I can tell you, in my years of caring for patients, we've had patients on ventilators that have had massive intracerebral bleed, and they could remain on that ventilator, trach to a vent. And I've had patients that because they had no family to care for them, or there was one patient that had one daughter, and that daughter had to work. There was no way she could take her home and care for her. They had no insurance, and that lady said, she said, I no longer want to be left on this. So to that patient, she made that decision thinking of her daughter who could never care for her, and she was laying there in our hospital and could not really go anywhere. Her chances of ever getting off the ventilator was nil, and she made that decision. And so to her, that was disproportionate. But it's interesting how patients will factor. I've had other patients who are on ventilator that had children and they're like, Mama, we're gonna take care of you. We trained them to suction, to take, and they took her home. But the patient saw where it was not a burden to her family, right? Because they made her feel, Mama, we're gonna do everything to take care of you. So it's about the patient, right? So thinking about what's proportionate for me may be disproportionate for someone else, right? But it's that individual person. So this is a much more important reason why planning ahead, having the conversation, talking with our families about what is important to us is so valuable. So stop me as we go along. So other discerning Catholic values are when the patient is imminently dying and they usually have no desire to eat. As the organs are shutting down, somehow God made us that way. He's so amazing that as the patient is dying, the organs are starting to shut down. Circulation is slowing down. The body is conserving energy. And usually the patient has no desire to eat. I can tell you that's usually the first sign of dying. When they keep sick, they don't want to eat. And family members, I mean, the patient may still be interacting, but when they are no longer wanting to eat, that's usually the first sign of dying. And yes, feeding and loving is part of human life, right? So this makes it very hard for family members who want to keep feeding. So what we encourage when the patient is dying is comfort food, okay? If the patient says, I want to eat, then we give them a little food. As long as it's clear that we know they're dying and just give them comfort food. But if they don't want to eat, then it's okay. We ensure that their mouths are clean because the organs are slowing down. It's not going to process the food anymore. So, you know, as Father Shofi mentioned earlier, there are complications to artificial nutrition and hydration. Some of the complications can be aspiration. So if the organs are slowing down, the body is shutting down, the food is likely to go in the lung. The patient will aspirate. And when they're dying, we want them to be as comfortable as possible. But if that food goes in the lungs, they're going to get pneumonia. The breathing is going to be more distressing. One of the complications or side effects, if you please, of artificial nutrition and hydration, well, primarily the peg feeding is we have to tie them down, right? And it's lack of human dignity, oftentimes. Oftentimes that patient is isolated. Many of them are in nursing homes. They're tied down and it's lack of human. And you see them trying to fight, because we don't want them to be pulling out the tubes. Isolation from human contact and human love. Because most of the times that nurse or that tech is just going to fill the tube feeding bag. Nobody's actually interacting with it. It takes 2 minutes to go in there, fill the bag, and you leave. Versus comfort feeding. I'm sitting, I'm loving you, I'm talking with you, and I'm interacting with you, right? And then the complications of aspiration. So again, is this feeding of benefit? Yes, if they're in a persistent vegetative state, absolutely we have to feed. But when they're imminently dying is where we have to weigh the benefits versus the harm, okay? And it's all about what that patient would have wanted. So If that's important to the patient, we will honor the patient's wishes. But once it's causing aspiration, then we have to ask, are we causing more harm than helping this patient? So it's really weighing benefits burden, proportionate, disproportionate. So it's each patient's value, listening to patients and family. In the case of Terry Schiavo, and the fact that her husband said she had that conversation, under Florida law, a living will can be verbal or it can be in writing. So if Terry really shared with her husband at some point that she would not want to be in a vegetative state, that's her verbal living will. But you see what happens when we only say things verbally, right? It's his word against the parents' word. So this is why we highly recommend everybody putting it in writing. Because when it's in writing, and I can tell you when patients are actively in a terminal state, the emotions take over the real thing. Because even patients will choose a healthcare surrogate, and that healthcare surrogate is so emotional at the end that they're wanting to make contrary decisions to the patient's wishes. And that's just part of being human. We're human beings, you know. So as patients draw close to imminent death from a terminal or end-stage condition, providing nutrition and hydration may become excessively burdensome, not provide comfort, and therefore is not obligatory. And that is part of our ethical and religious directives. Any questions on that so far? So it's really patient specific. And it's really about you and what your values are. And putting it in writing, having these conversations, letting your family know, because when you are at the end, you are not going to be able to speak for yourself. And we have to honor whatever that person is who is now your voice. So it's choosing the right person to be your voice. And most importantly, putting it in writing. So that's what I'm highly recommending. So if you, yes.
I apologize. I'm the virtual learner.
Yeah.
I have a question. Has anyone ever questioned the legality of a verbal living will?
The verbal living will is well, the legality is under Florida law, it's a verbal wish is considered a living will. Yeah, so the law, if you look at Florida statute 765, that is the advance directive. The definition of a living will, it's either, it's the patient's wishes, either verbally or in writing. But that's, we just have to believe what they're saying. Well, he told me at one time that he never wanted, or he told me that he wants to remain on that. We just have to take their word for it, right? So, but putting things in writing is so much better, so much better.
It's more credible when it's in a group, because there's more than one way.
It's in a group too, if you have the whole family, and I'll do that in a family meeting. I'll say, okay, tell me about mom. Has mom ever had a conversation with you? When we have nothing in writing, and they'll all tell the story, you know, but you may have some who contradict, family members who contradict. Then we have a dilemma, you know? So, yes, that.
Right. So legally, it's all about the proxy. If the proxy is a legal proxy, right? Like in the case of Michael, then he has the word. And the judge has to fail in favor.
Of course, because he's now her voice. Exactly. He's now her voice. Yeah. But a proxy, we're going to talk about the difference between Florida proxy and a healthcare surrogate or dual provider, because I'll share with you the difference. So let's take out our yellow paper. I'm sorry, what's his name online?
Chris.
Hi, Chris.
Hey.
I'm asking everyone to circle. You're going to get the paper, but it's these questions that you see on the screen, right? So again, you're imagining yourself as if you're very sick with COVID, or you have a terminal or end stage condition. And so this is an example of how to discern your values. So if you were in a situation where you were imminently dying, what would be important to you? So to have a doctor who knows me as a whole person, how important would that be to you? Very important, somewhat, or not important? So circle your own answers, because this is about you, okay? To have a nurse I feel comfortable with, how important would that be to you? To be free from pain, how important is that to you? To have my financial affairs in order. To have an advocate who knows my values and my priorities. How important is that to you? To have my family with me. To be at peace with God. To maintain my dignity and be kept clean. Not being a burden to my family. To have someone who will listen to me. Not being connected to machines. How important is that? To be able to talk about what scares me. To not die alone. How important is that to you? And then I'd like you to flip the page because we have some others on the other side. So I'd like you to think of the 3-person committee who should be consulted on any decisions made about whether to continue life-saving care if you are unable to communicate. It doesn't have to be 3, it may be 2, it may be 1. But stop for a minute and think as, who is it that you trust, that you feel you would want? So 1, 2, or 3 names, just jot it down. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And then the last question is, who haven't you talked with in more than 6 months that you would want to talk with before you died? Okay, so this is just a simple example of what discerning your values are. So let me ask you a question. Those names you just jotted down as the people that you feel you would want to be the ones to make decisions for you, do they know all the things you circled on the previous page? Do they? Do you think they do? No, more than likely not, right? So this gives you an example of what truly discerning your values means. That I need to be able to think of who these people are. I need to then go and talk with them and say, listen, these are the things that are important to me. Because your healthcare surrogate, which is the name of the person that you would be choosing, or a durable power of attorney for healthcare, are the people that should know you, that under any medical circumstance, when you can't speak for yourself and the doctor says, what would Rose want? You can say, oh yeah, I know her well enough. She wouldn't want this, or yes, she would want you to treat her. So that is who your decision maker needs to be. But most importantly, you have to go and ask them, are they willing to be your decision maker? Because I can tell you, it's a big responsibility. And when the patient is lying there critically ill, the burdens on your shoulder is very heavy. I am my best friend's healthcare surrogate. She has 3 adult daughters. And as her best friend, she knows me, we've had conversation, and she decided to have the conversation with her 3 daughters. And they're like, no, mommy, we can't do this. Let Auntie Rose. So we owe it to the people, and this is why I've chosen to do community education, because we're obligated to ask patients on admission, do you have an advance directive? And if they say no, just let me fill it out. and many of them will just put a name. Sometimes the people don't even know their names are here. We've not discussed our values with them, and then suddenly we're calling them, oh, you are listed as a healthcare, oh, I am? And now they're having to make decisions, right? How unfair is that, right? There you go. So please, please, please think about these people. And I want to empower you to then go and have those conversations. Are you all comfortable with knowing what CPR is, what intubation and comfort measures, right? I think you guys are comfortable. We don't need to go over that. All right, so we've discerned our values, right? Now we're ready to decide who are we gonna talk with, right? So we wanna talk with loved ones. How am I gonna approach them? So we can say, especially now that's COVID, right? You can say, you know, with all that's going on with COVID, I need to think about the future. Will you help me? So this is a nice way to kind of sit and just, you know, talk with someone. Or you can say, I was thinking about what happened, especially if you've heard of someone who maybe have died or you've had experience. You say, I was thinking about what happened to, and I want to be prepared. Or we can say, even though I'm okay right now, I'm worried that I may not be able to speak for myself at the end of life and want to be prepared by sharing my wishes with you. It's important to also talk with our healthcare providers. So the Dear Doctor letter is a Stanford University letter project. So I provided you with the website. You can go there. It's in different languages. And so people who don't want to talk to family, there's a family, Dear Family, and you can just write them letters. So that's another way we can communicate. Or you can communicate with your doctor and tell your doctor exactly what you want. Or we can be bold enough when we go and visit our doctor and say, doctor, I really want to have a conversation about my end of life care wishes. CMS is now paying physicians to have these conversations, starting 2 years ago. But many of these doctors aren't comfortable. They feel, oh, I'm not going to bring this up. I'm taking hope away. But we are helping patients and our customers and everybody in the community by understanding death is a part of life. It's a transition, it's a part. So we shouldn't be afraid to talk about, you know, what is important to us. So I'm just going to show you a video now that is going to help you to understand, you know, how do you determine who will speak for you?
Your healthcare proxy, like if you need someone to tell the doctor what to, I just go with whatever the doctors say. I wouldn't want to bother them. They're so busy. Doctors know best, right? Be your healthcare proxy? Sure, I'd be happy to. If I'm in town, check out my Instagram pics from Peru. Wish you were here.
Oh, I can never let you go. I can't even throw a plant away. As long as it's got one little green leaf. I'd be like, can't we upload her to the cloud?
Well, heck yeah. I've given this a lot of thought. Let me tell you what decisions you're best off going with. You never let them resuscitate you. And if they even try to hook you up to one of those breathing machines, never. I got this. I totally got this.
How can you even talk about this? I can't, okay? I just can't. Mom, it's not like you're gonna die. No, I can't die right now.
Oh wait, did I show you that meme from iBunny? The cat and the dishwasher? Oh my gosh, okay. So the cat's like, bleh. And then he's like, wah! Oh wait, sorry, what?
Well, honey, you and I have been through so much together. Here's what we'll do. We'll sit down, get a cup of coffee, and you tell me what matters to you.
Well, it wouldn't be easy. I mean, I'd be sad, but I have your back.
I remember when we went through this with Mom, we really spoke for her. So I think I can do that for you. Let's talk about what you do.
So it's so important to have the conversation with the person you're considering and be sure that they are willing to do this. Okay, so that's just an example. So let's say, how do we, it's not easy to go and have this conversation. So we find that in this scenario, like many elderly people have terminal end stage conditions and really want to talk with their family member, but are afraid that the young adults are just going to say, oh, don't think about it. You're not going to die. We don't need to talk about it now. So we really want to empower them to say, these are things that are important that I want you to help me to make decisions with. And vice versa, it could be the young adult who is looking at an elderly family member who is terminal or has some kind of end stage condition and is saying, how am I going to approach? So I'm now going to show another video. This video is going to show the wrong way to approach them, and then it's going to show you the right way.
Mom, Dad, sweetie, can we talk?
Everyone, dies.
So, how do you want to go? Do you have a plan for your end of life care? Because I don't. Don't take this the wrong way, but you're not getting any younger.
So I was binge watching Game of Thrones, which reminded me that everybody dies. Oh,
You've heard of a birth plan, right? It's like that. Only the opposite.
So that was the wrong approach.
I need your help with something. Can we talk? My biggest fear is losing you, and that I won't know how you want me to care for you toward the end.
remember what happened to Aunt Maria? I don't want that to happen to you.
You've taken care of me your whole life. Now it's my turn to take care of you.
So it may require us to go and stand in front of the mirror and practice how we're going to have that conversation. But I think if we do this for ourselves and maybe fill out our own documents, then that's a nice way to approach our families and say, in this whole COVID time, I just had a lecture of the importance. I did this for myself. May I share what I have done? And then that's a way to say, would you want to share with me what's important to you? So I put this slide in because this is also important. In order for you to make an informed decision about what treatment options is, you need to be informed. Many times patients and families don't know the right questions. And those are things I encourage them to do. I tell them to write these questions down. So this is a nice mnemonic to think about. What are the benefits, both short and long-term to me? How will this maintain or improve my quality of life in the long run? So you're looking at treatment options, proportionate, disproportionate, beneficial, harmful. What are the risks and burdens? How might this compromise reduce my quality of life in the long run? What are the alternatives, including doing nothing? What is the goal? If a test, does the information matter to you? If a treatment, is it intended to lengthen my life? So it all depends on what your individual goals are. So this is a way for you to really pull information from your doctors so that you can be better informed to make an informed decision. So just want to encourage you to use that. So we've discerned our values. We've spoken to who we think we would want to be our decision maker. Now we want to put this in writing. based on the experience we saw with Terry Schiavo, it is so important. So this is the Catholic Declaration on Life or Death. It's the Healthcare Advance Directive for Florida Catholics, and it's approved by the bishops of Florida. So an advance directive is either a healthcare surrogate, or some people have what is called a durable power of attorney for healthcare, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, or a living will. Healthcare proxy in Florida is not an advance directive. It's the legal next of kin hierarchy. And we're going to talk about the disadvantage of waiting to be incapacitated so that the legal next of kin can be appointed, because this person, this healthcare surrogate, is someone you trust, someone you have had the conversation with, someone who knows you and can be your voice when you cannot speak for yourself. So key things to remember about this document: it's applicable for 18 and older. There is no expiration date. The date that you sign this document is a date that will be there forever until you, and only you, can make those changes. So when you're incapacitated, your family cannot change the document. This is your legal document. You treat it like any other legal document. It's important to give copies to everybody, including, most importantly, the person who is going to be making the decisions for you. It's valid in most states. And again, as I said, no expiration date. When you come to the hospital, we are required under the Patient Self-Determination Act to ask every patient, do you have an advance directive? If you don't have one, would you like to complete one? Because we are obligated to provide care based on the patient's preferences. So this is why when the patient is incapacitated, we have to have someone representing the patient. And we either go down the legal next of kin hierarchy, or we have to go to court and get a guardian. But the physicians are not allowed to make independent decisions on patients. They have to make decisions based on what we call shared decision making. When your wishes are known, decisions are made on what is called substituted judgment. So from an ethical standpoint, if a patient verbally said what their wishes are or put it in writing, that's their living will. And we then provide care based on, and decisions are made based on substituted judgment. When we don't know the wishes of the patient, then we make decisions based on what is in the patient's best interest. So it would be the proxy and the doctors collaborating and then choosing treatment plan based on what is in the patient's best interest. But it's better for us to know that we're doing what we're doing because this is what the patient would have wanted. So the healthcare surrogate document, again, it's completed by any individual 18 years and over. And you notice I've put in red, should be someone you trust who knows you and knows your wishes and is willing to always honor your wishes, because those are the ethical dilemmas we get in the hospital all the time. That's when we get called all the time, because decisions are being made contrary to what the patient would have wanted. So key things about when is this document valid? It's only filled out by you while you're capacitated. So if the patient now is incapacitated, it's too late to complete this document because it should be done in advance. So it's an advance directive. Things to remember: one witness may be a spouse or a blood relative, and a healthcare surrogate cannot be a witness. That's a conflict of interest. So let's kind of look at the document. So again, your name would be there. And you have a choice of choosing a primary or an alternate healthcare surrogate. So you can choose two people. It's important that their name, their address, their phone numbers is all completely filled out. Giving them copies, you keep the original, put it in a safe place. When you come to the hospital, we will be asking you for a copy. And Baptist Health stores copies of patients' advance directive under your medical records. So you won't have to bring a copy every time you are being admitted. So the important thing to remember is these people cannot sign as witnesses. A healthcare surrogate and a living will does not need to be notarized. You only need 2 witnesses. Only one may be a spouse or blood relative, and a surrogate cannot be a witness, okay? The living will now document in which one expresses his or her desires regarding the life-prolonging procedures in cases of qualifying condition. So to protect that vulnerable, incapacitated patient, physicians cannot withhold or withdraw life-prolonging interventions unless there's clear documentation, and it requires 2 doctors to examine the patient and determine that the patient is either terminal, end stage, or in an end stage condition. But it's also based on the patient's living will. Under the Catholic directive, persistent vegetative state is not listed. But in the regular Florida advance directive, persistent vegetative state under Florida law is listed as one of the qualifying conditions. So that's why it's even more important to fill out our own Catholic directive, where persistent vegetative state is not listed. So a living will is not a DNR. People are confused about that. It's the patient's stated wishes. And those wishes are only going to be activated when the patient meets the qualifying condition. So in this case, only when the patient is terminal or in an end stage condition, as documented by 2 physicians, then it's time to honor the patient's wish. Otherwise, full care needs to be provided. So a living will, like a healthcare surrogate, does not need to be notarized. It's signed by the capacitated patient, and we only need 2 witnesses. Only one may be a spouse or a blood relative, and a healthcare surrogate cannot be a witness. Okay, any questions on that? So here is the our Catholic living will, very clear. You can see when I'm incapacitated and I have a terminal condition or I have an end stage condition, right? And so I be provided, so when I'm in those conditions, I be provided care and comfort, and that my pain be relieved. No inappropriate, excessive, burdensome, or disproportionate means be used to prolong my life. This can include medical or surgical procedures. There should be a presumption in favor of providing nutrition and hydration to me, including medically assisted nutrition and hydration, unless they cannot reasonably be expected to prolong my life, or the means used to deliver the nutrition and hydration are excessively burdensome and do not offer sufficient benefit or would cause me sufficient physical discomfort, or I'm imminently dying from an irreversible condition. There are additional instructions that we can put here. For example, if you would want to be an organ donor, but I also would like to encourage, if you truly want to be an organ donor, there is a donatelife.org site, and that is where, you know, that's the registry in Florida, or through your driver's license, your name will automatically go to the registry. If it's only put on this document, they won't know because it's not, your name is not listed on the registry. Additional things we encourage is for pregnant women women to write, if I'm pregnant, you know, to save my unborn child. That is so important to write as additional information. So it's putting all the things that are important so we can truly honor what your wishes are. Again, I shared the signature, because validity means that the patient must print and sign. And the two witnesses, only one may be a spouse or blood relative, and surrogates cannot sign as witness. Then the document is not valid, because that's a conflict of interest. Any questions so far? So the third form of advance directive is what is called a durable power of attorney for healthcare. So the difference with this document and the healthcare surrogate is this document includes financial responsibility. This person is also responsible for the person's estate, their finances, etc. So this is usually formulated by a lawyer, and this is the only document that needs to be notarized. So a living will and a healthcare surrogate does not need to be notarized, but a durable power of attorney for healthcare document must be notarized, okay? So this is the third form of advance directive. So
My
here,
letter's called Don't Panic, It's Okay, a letter to my family. If you are faced with a decision that you're not ready for, it's okay. I'll try to let you know what I would want for various circumstances, but if you come to something we haven't anticipated, it's okay. And if you come to a decision point and what you decide results in my death, it's okay. You don't need to worry that you've caused my death. You haven't. I will die because of my illness or my body failing or whatever. You don't need to feel responsible. Forgiveness is not required. But if you feel bad, responsible, guilty, first of all, don't. And second of all, you are loved and forgiven. If you're faced with a snap decision, don't panic. Choose comfort. Choose home. Choose less intervention. Choose to be together at my side, holding my hand, singing, laughing, loving, celebrating, and carrying on. I will keep loving you and watching you and being proud of you.
so this is another means of communicating to our loved ones, you know, is writing them a letter. So, you know, the Stanford Letter Project, this document, this is the most, you know, important because it's legal. Once you sign it and date it, that's legal, that's your wishes, that's your document. But as I said in the beginning, up to 70% of patients do not take the time to have these conversations and fill these documents. So when they come to our hospital, if they're incapacitated and none of this has been done, we have to choose based on the legal next of kin, a healthcare proxy. In states like New York and Jersey, they refer to healthcare proxy as the person you choose, which is our healthcare surrogate. But proxy in Florida, under Florida law, is the legal next of kin. So here are the challenges with this. If the first in line, if the patient has no spouse, then we have to call how many children? 6 children. But we don't know if that patient would want their children to make decisions for them. And if they've not had the conversation, just imagine we have 6 people sitting around the desk and we say, what would mommy want? Or what would daddy want? That's a big burden on them if they've not had the conversation. And can you imagine all 6 of them agreeing with the same thing? No, right? Those who are closer and who are not. I mean, I've had a daughter that the siblings ganged up on her. They lived out of state. She took care of her mom the whole time. The patient was now in multi-system organ failure, and she wanted to make decisions, and they all flew in and literally was attacking her. We had to sit for a whole hour with them, tell us about mom. The doctor had to explain about the failing organs. And finally, after they got the informed information, then they collectively understood and could make an informed decision. But the lady was so scared for her life, the way they were rude to her, and she was the only one that's been caring for her mom the whole time. So this can be the biggest dilemma, okay? The biggest dilemma. I remember taking care of a patient once. She had intracerebral bleed. We trached her. She was on the bench. She was on the step-down floor. And they had appointed her daughter, a daughter and a brother as proxy. And she had a large family, many children, many siblings. And so this went on for months, and the patient wasn't really getting better. She was continuing to have organ failure, but she was still on a ventilator, and they were just not comfortable. They didn't really know the mother's wishes, and they were struggling. And when patients have bleed, there are times they'll have periods of lucidity, right? Where they're awake and they're communicating, and then they go back in a coma. So this lady had those episodes. And we have a wonderful respiratory therapist as he's taking care of the patient, regardless of whether the patient is awake or not, he communicates with them. And this lady, he had told her he was going on vacation when she was like in her comatose state, and that he was going away. He came back. And so the family were thinking that maybe they wanted to remove the ventilator because, they felt at that point it may be disproportionate. But they didn't know the patient's wishes at all. And I think it was a God intervention, because the therapist went in the room. He had just come back from vacation, and he's in the room, suctioning her and she opened her eyes and she said, "How is your vacation?" She literally, she was in a coma when he spoke to her, semi-comatose. And he was so shocked. And I remember he called me, he's like, "Rose, she's asking me about my vacation. I spoke with her in herself." So I said, "Stop right there. Let us get our psychologist to go back in the room," because he had been following the patient for all these months. And I called him and I said, "Can you please go in and reassess this lady?" Because she somehow could remember Louis telling her he was going on vacation 2 weeks ago. And of course, the whole family was outside, grandchildren and everybody, because they came for this moment. And Dr. Insera went in and he spent time with her. And sure enough, she was capacitated. And he said to her, "How do you feel about being on a ventilator?" And she said she didn't have a problem. All she had was a headache. And he said, "Well, when you're not able to speak for yourself, we have your brother and your daughter making it." She's like, "Oh no, I want my sister." That was a classic example. So immediately, because she was now capacitated, I ran and got the form. I'm like, "Can you please have her sign this?" So it just tells you that we shouldn't wait for this to happen, right? We really should be making these decisions, choosing the right person that we would want. And so fortunately for this lady, we were able to now get her to fill out her own document and choose her own healthcare surrogate. So this is a Florida yellow DNR. This is the do not resuscitate. It's a physician's order. So the patient is already in a terminal or end stage condition, and the patient would sign, or if the patient is not able to sign, the legal decision maker would sign, and a physician with the physician's license. And so EMS will not resuscitate because it's a Department of Health do not resuscitate. My living will is not a DNR. My living will is only my wish. Everything needs to be done for me until two physicians say it's time to activate my living will. Whereas if I have a DNR, a decision has already been made not to resuscitate me because I already have a terminal or end stage condition. You see the difference between the two? So just wanted to clarify.
Now that I'm older, it's a lot easier.
So, so I think this was the end,
Now
and
that I'm
then
older, it's a lot
this is
easier
just
to
closing video.
open up about things because I'm more comfortable with myself too. I think a lot of my friends have also gone through similar experiences with seeing their parents care for their grandparents.
Just say that my parents in their own way made it a little bit easier for me because they just leave the living well. And they did put out, like, you know, that they didn't want any artificial feedings, they don't want any keto treatments, and, you know. So that, not that those decisions were easy, but at least I was able to respect their wishes because I knew what they were.
Yeah, discussed it, like the fear of getting older and not having our parents and what life would be like when we're the kind of head of the family. It's scary. We've had the conversation. Have you had the conversation?
Right. So, so these are the various Institute of Health. That's the website, the Conversation Project. The Stanford Letter Project, you can go to that website and see the various letters. The exercise game that we played was part of this Go Wish. The Catholic and Religious Directive site is there. And so in summary, you can remain in control of your life by taking the time to have the conversation about your wishes at end of life by first discerning your values, having the conversation with loved ones and healthcare providers about what's important to you, and clearly documenting your wishes. Advanced directive documents are healthcare surrogate, living will, and durable power of attorney for healthcare. Advanced directive documents are only valid when they're signed, dated by you, the capacitated person, and witnessed by two people. Only one witness may be a spouse or a blood relative. A surrogate cannot be a witness. A living will is the patient's wish. It's not a DNR. That is activated when the patient's clinical condition meets the criteria of the living will, which is terminal or end stage. Florida yellow DNR is a Department of Health do not resuscitate order. And healthcare proxy is not an advanced directive. It is the legal next of kin hierarchy used when an incapacitated patient does not have a healthcare surrogate or durable power of attorney for healthcare. So that's it. Any questions? I hope you found this information valuable. Yes.
I have one, but it's more of a statistics question.
In
your experience with your years of your career,
yeah.
how many, because when we saw with the Shiloh case, that the parents were hoping that she would get out of that state.
Recover.
In those great states that you've seen, like what percentage actually returns to normal functioning?
It's interesting that you asked. With the neurological injury, it's so difficult. The main thing I remember, I don't remember if you were at the conference, but I went to one of our ethics conference, our national conferences, and I was actually in a session with a physician who had been in a major auto accident, and she was up there lecturing. Major auto accident that everyone, the intensivists, everybody kept saying it's time to withdraw life support. And one of her colleagues, I think she was a pathologist, one of her colleagues advocated to keep going, and he searched the whole country and found the best neurological rehabilitation, and that's where she went. And so her message was, having the best rehab was what helped her to recover. So, you know, whether that was just an unusual case because the type of trauma and injury she had, it was unlikely that she would ever recover. And there she was standing. But I can tell you, working in critical care for so many years, we ultimately developed what we call champions, meaning based on statistics, this patient may have had a 90% chance of dying, and they walked out of here. So we would have parties every year where they would come back. We would have a dinner, and I can tell you, I often didn't recognize the patient. I only remembered the family member because they look so good. Because we don't know. So it's like, you know, physicians can't predict, right? They can only go by the medical facts. And it's the same even when we withdraw life support. We don't know when they're gonna die, right? We can't say they're gonna die in the next hour. We can get, it's really God, you know? So our focus is making sure they're comfortable. And then when God's ready for them, he takes them. But it's very hard. I mean, if they're brain dead is death, right? Because the brain is dead, the brainstem is not functioning. So legally that, you know, they're dead, right? But the challenge too is the heart functions autonomically. So even when the brain is dead, the autonomic function will work for a little while. And as long as we have them on life support, we can still support that life, you know, that body can still be going and the heart may continue to beat for a little while. So, you know, like in the Jewish religion, you know, in New York's law allows the Orthodox Jew to take the brain dead patient home, because in their religion, until that heart stops, that person is not dead, you know. But all other states, I mean, neurologically, I mean, we've shipped, I had one incident where it was a Orthodox Jew that the patient was clearly brain dead, but they wanted the body to be shipped to, the patient to be shipped to New York, you know? So we don't have a crystal ball. You know, once the organs are failing and we are artificially supporting a blood pressure, we're artificially support, then we know they're dying, but do we know how long they're gonna last? We don't know, you know, we don't often know until we see the vital signs dropping, you know? But a lot of the neurological injury, like the Terry Schiavo, those are usually a lot harder for families because they see the reflexes, they see, but although Terry's eyes may be moving, she wasn't purposely, if you say, Terry, look to the left, Terry, look to the right, she wasn't following. It was all just reflexes, but it's harder for families. It's so, yeah. If it's better for them to be in a total coma than to appear to have their eyes open. It's just so much harder for families, you know? So I hope you found this helpful. It truly was a pleasure. I left you just a short evaluation. I don't know if you're able to just fill it out for me. I would appreciate just your feedback. And yeah, just turn it on. Do you feel, yeah, that one. Do you feel that this is something you'll do for yourselves? Do you feel, and be able to go home and talk with families? Yeah.
Most definitely.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so important. It really is.
It's a scary thought.
It's a scary thought, but it's just talking about it, just casually as you're sitting around, just say, you know, just wanted to share these thoughts with you and just make it a casual conversation, you know?
Faith test, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
If they believe in afterlife, then it puts it in a certain context.
Absolutely. Yes.
While we're covering this form, I wonder if I could pick your brain a little bit.
Sure.
As a nurse,
Uh-huh.
in a case precisely in PBS and the peg is disconnected, what is available for that patient so that they may die in peace if it's going to be prolonged for several days without nutrition or hydration?
So if they're imminently dying, it's the body is the organs are shutting down. So it's like God made us that way that we go in this euphoric state. It's almost like a sleepy state, you know?
Yeah.
And that's how he made us, you know? So it's like the organs, you know, the circulation is slowing down. This is why you start seeing the fingers mottle the lip, because the blood is now pooling to just the vital organs, and eventually, you know, they die. So they're not feeling anything. They're in like just a euphoric state. They're not sorry. In fact, the term we use is they're not dying because they're not eating. They're not eating because they're dying. So this is what we try to explain to the family. Yeah.
So the natural analgesics that the body releases.
The natural, yeah, you go in this la land, la euphoric state, you know, that they're comfortable. They don't want to eat. And we force it and we see them vomiting and the thing goes in their lungs. It's like we're causing more discomfort for them. Because once it goes in the lung, the respiration is like so uncomfortable. And we've now caused pneumonia in the dying stage, you know? So it's just a natural euphoric, like the electrolyte imbalance, all our electrolyte is so imbalanced now that it just creates this, the best way I can describe it is just you're in a euphoric state, you know, and no need. But
On
that's
the
just
outside, it may look impressive because the person
right.
is no longer eating, so they're dying.
So it's not starving. They're not dying because they're not eating. They're not eating because the body is dying. Exactly. And when I try to explain it that way, then, you know, so the main thing is we just keep the mouth comfortable, mouth clean and do a lot moisture, you know, and I said only if the patient is asking for food that we would give it. Otherwise, we're causing more harm than helping because they're not hungry. They're not hungry. They're not starving because the organs are shutting down. Yeah. So if we use that term, they're not dying because they're not eating. They're not eating because they're dying. Yeah. I can exit my thing, right?
Good.
Yeah.
Close out.
Huh?
You can, I see, yeah.
How do I don't want
Need to
to
close, so we can close.
just close. Yeah. I'll let you, just so I can take my, I don't want to leave it.
Let me
I want
close.
to close this stick.
Sure, hold on, let me just.
Any other questions?
Okay, we're gonna end the recording then.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Mm.